This is a fortress of faith, a monument of art and power built to honor one of the most beloved saints in history. But the man buried in its crypt, Francis of Assisi, would have hated it. He commanded his followers to own nothing. No land, no houses, no money, not even the books they prayed from. We know the popular story, a gentle man who preached to birds and tamed a wolf, a figure of serene, simple piety. But the true story is far more radical, more dangerous, and more consequential. Francis didn't just start a movement. He unleashed a revolution of absolute poverty in an age of immense wealth and institutional power. A revolution so profound and so threatening to the established order that the Church itself had to capture it, tame it, and ultimately transform it into something he would never have recognized. This is the secret history of the Franciscans. How did a brotherhood founded on the principle of having nothing become one of the most powerful, wealthy, and influential organizations the world has ever known? How did the battle for the soul of this humble movement, a battle between its founders' radical ideal and the needs of a global institution, end up changing not just the Church, but the very course of Western civilization? This is the entire story of the humble idea that conquered the world. The Prince of Assisi. To find the origin of one of the world's most radical spiritual movements, we must begin not in a church or a monastery, but in a world intoxicated with a powerful new religion, money. The Italy of the late 12th and early 13th centuries was a place of vibrant, chaotic, and transformative change. The old rigid feudal order of landowning nobles and serfs was being challenged by a new and dynamic force. A powerful merchant class, enriched by the burgeoning trade in silks, spices, and fine textiles, was on the rise. Cities like Assisi, perched on a hill in the heart of Umbria, were becoming bustling centers of commerce. Their streets filled with the sights and sounds of a society in flux. This was a world where status was no longer determined solely by birthright, but by the weight of the gold florins in your purse. In this world of new money and boundless ambition, Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone was a prince. He was not a prince of royal blood, but something far more modern, a prince of commerce and charisma. His father, Pietro di Bernardone, was one of Assisi's most successful cloth merchants, a man who had traveled to the great fairs of France and returned with wealth and a taste for French culture. He lavished this wealth on his son Giovanni, whom he nicknamed Francesco, or the Frenchman, a nod to his own commercial success and worldly aspirations. And Francesco, or Francis, as we know him, played the part to perfection. By all contemporary accounts, he was the undisputed leader of the youth of Assisi. He was handsome, charming, witty, and a natural trendsetter. He was famous for his fine clothes, often made from the most expensive cloth in his father's shop, and for the lavish parties and banquets he would host for his friends, spending his father's money with a reckless, joyful abandon. He was a singer of songs, a teller of tales, a romantic figure who embodied the new secular pleasures of his age. His world was one of troubadours' feasts and the pursuit of earthly glory. But beneath this glittering surface lay a deep and restless ambition. For a wealthy merchant's son in 13th century Italy, there was still one social class. He could not easily enter one form of glory that money could not buy: the status of a knight. The world of chivalry, of armored combat, of noble valor on the battlefield was the ultimate fantasy. To be a knight was to transcend the grubby world of trade and achieve a higher, more romantic form of renown. This was Francis's true dream. He did not yearn to be a saint. He yearned to be a hero, to win fame and glory on the battlefield. In 1202, his chance came. A petty war broke out between his hometown of Assisi and the rival city of Perugia. Francis, equipping himself with the finest horse and armor his father's money could buy, rode off to war, his head filled with dreams of chivalric glory. The reality was a brutal awakening. The Assisian forces were swiftly defeated, and Francis was taken prisoner. He spent a year in a grim, squalid Perugian dungeon. For a young man accustomed to luxury and freedom, the experience was a profound shock. He was no longer the Prince of Assisi. He was just another captive surrounded by the misery and despair of defeated men. He returned to Assisi a year later, ransomed by his father, but he was a changed man. The easy charm and carefree spirit were gone, replaced by a brooding listlessness. Soon after his return, he was struck by a long and severe illness, likely a consequence of his year in prison. The illness confined him to his bed for weeks, forcing him into a state of prolonged inactivity and introspection. When he finally recovered enough to walk again, he looked out upon the familiar, beautiful Umbrian countryside, but saw it with new eyes. The world that had once filled him with such joy now seemed empty and tasteless. The sickness of the body had triggered a deeper sickness of the soul. His old life, his old ambitions now felt hollow. The dream of knightly glory had turned to dust. He tried one last time to grasp his old ambition. He joined the army of a local nobleman who was heading south to fight for the Pope once again, equipping himself with the most magnificent armor and a noble horse. But on the very first night of the journey, he had a strange dream. A voice called to him and showed him a great hall filled with shields and armor, all marked with the sign of the cross. "These," the voice said, "are for you and your soldiers." Francis, still thinking in worldly terms, interpreted this as a promise of the military glory he craved. But the next night the voice came again, asking him, "Francis, who can do more for you, the master or the servant?" When Francis replied, "The master," the voice said, "Then why do you desert the master for the servant, the rich lord for the poor man?" Francis awoke in a state of spiritual turmoil. He turned back, abandoning the military expedition, and returned to Assisi a laughingstock to those who had seen him ride out in such splendor. The Prince of Assisi was now seen as a coward and a fool. He began to spend his days in solitude, wandering the countryside, praying in abandoned chapels, trying to understand the meaning of the voice that had called him. He was a man caught between two worlds, having rejected the life of a merchant and failed at the life of a warrior. He was searching for a new master to serve, a new kind of glory to win. He did not yet know that his quest would lead him not to a battlefield or a royal court, but to the most despised and feared outcasts of his society, and to a ruined stone chapel where a voice would speak to him one last time, giving him a command that would change his life and the world forever. The cross in the ruins. The young man who returned to Assisi was a ghost of his former self. The charismatic Prince of Parties was gone, replaced by a solitary and haunted figure. Francis now spent his days wandering the Umbrian countryside, avoiding his old friends and the life of revelry he had once led. He was searching, though he did not yet know for what. He would spend hours praying in the many small, dilapidated chapels that dotted the hills outside the city walls. He gave his fine clothes to the poor, and would sit with beggars trying to understand their world. This period of his life was a slow, painful shedding of his old skin, a conscious effort to peel away the layers of wealth, status, and ambition that had once defined him. The true turning point, the moment that tested the very limits of his old self, did not happen in a church, but on a dusty road. Francis, like most people of his time, held a deep, visceral revulsion for lepers. They were the ultimate outcasts, physically disfigured by their disease, and socially condemned, forced to live apart from society and ring a bell to warn others of their approach. For Francis, they represented the pinnacle of human misery and ugliness. One day, while riding his horse, he came face to face with a leper. His first instinct was his old one to turn away in disgust, to spur his horse and flee. But something stopped him. He saw this encounter not as a chance event, but as a spiritual test. In a profound act of will, he dismounted, walked towards the leper, and not only gave him money, but embraced him, kissing his afflicted hand. In that moment, he would later say what had once been bitter and repulsive became a source of sweetness for his soul and body. By embracing the person he most feared and despised, he had broken the back of his own pride and prejudice. He began to spend his time in the leper colonies outside the city, tending to the sick, cleaning their sores, and offering them the human comfort they had been denied. He was learning to see the face of Christ not in the stained glass of a grand cathedral, but in the face of the most rejected members of society. His search for purpose eventually led him to one particular ruined chapel, a small crumbling building dedicated to Saint Damien. It was here, while praying before an old Byzantine-style crucifix, that the defining moment of his conversion occurred. As he knelt in the dusty silence, he felt the painted eyes of Christ on the cross look down upon him, and he heard a voice speak clear and distinct. "Francis," the voice said, "go and rebuild my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruin." This was the command he had been waiting for. It was direct, it was specific, and it gave him a tangible mission. But his interpretation was at first completely literal. He believed Christ was asking him to physically repair the stone chapel of San Damiano. He threw himself into the task with the same zealous energy he had once devoted to planning parties. To get money for the materials, he went to his father's warehouse, took several bolts of the most expensive scarlet cloth, rode to the nearby market town of Foligno, and sold both the cloth and the horse. He then returned to San Damiano and tried to give the bag of money to the poor priest who lived there. The priest, wisely refusing to accept the stolen funds, allowed Francis to stay, but the bag of money was left sitting on a windowsill. When his father, Pietro di Bernardone, discovered the theft, he was enraged. This was not just a matter of lost money, it was a public humiliation. His son, the boy he had raised to be a great merchant or a noble knight, was now acting like a common thief and a religious fanatic, shaming the family name. Pietro, accompanied by a crowd of townsfolk, stormed down to San Damiano to confront his son. Francis, terrified of his father's wrath, hid for a month in a cave. But when he finally emerged, he was a different man. The fear was gone, replaced by a serene, unshakable resolve. He walked back into the city of Assisi, and the townspeople, seeing his gaunt, filthy appearance, mocked him, calling him a madman and throwing mud at him. His father, finding him in the street, was overcome with fury. He dragged Francis home and locked him in a small room. But Francis's mother, believing her son was touched by God, freed him while her husband was away. This set the stage for the final dramatic break. Pietro, realizing he had lost control of his son, decided to handle the matter legally. He dragged Francis before the civil authorities to reclaim his money and formally disinherit him. Francis, however, declared that as he had devoted himself to God, he was no longer under civil jurisdiction. So Pietro took his case to the highest authority in the city, the Bishop of Assisi. The trial took place in the public square before the entire town. Pietro made his case, demanding his son renounce his inheritance and return the money. What happened next became the foundational legend of the Franciscan Order. Francis, standing before the bishop, his father, and the assembled crowd, did something no one expected. He declared that he would gladly give back the money, but he would also give back everything else his father had ever given him. In a single, breathtaking act of radical renunciation, he stripped off all his fine clothes piece by piece until he stood completely naked in the town square. He handed the pile of clothes and the bag of money to his stunned father. "Listen, all of you," he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "Until today I have called Pietro di Bernardone my father, but from this day forward I can say in all truth, Our Father who art in heaven, in whom I have placed all my treasure and all my hope." The bishop, moved by this profound act, covered the naked young man with his own cloak. In that moment, Francis had died to his old world. He had no money, no property, no family name, not even the clothes on his back. He had divorced himself from the entire world of commerce, status, and worldly ambition. He was now truly free, a fool for Christ. He walked out of the city singing praises in French into the cold winter woods. He was about to begin a new life, and unknowingly to found a brotherhood that would be built on the radical, scandalous, and liberating principle of owning absolutely nothing. The Brotherhood of Lady Poverty. Francis walked out of Assisi and into the wilderness a man reborn. Stripped of everything, he now possessed a profound and intoxicating freedom. He begged for scraps of food, slept in abandoned caves, and spent his days physically rebuilding the ruined chapels of San Damiano and Portiuncula with his own hands, using stones he begged from the townspeople. He had traded his fine silks for a rough peasant's tunic, cinched at the waist with a piece of rope. He was no longer the son of a rich merchant. He was now a poverello, a little poor man, deliberately choosing a life at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. And in this state of complete renunciation, he found not misery, but a deep and profound joy. This joy was infectious. People in Assisi, who had once mocked him as a madman, began to see something else in his strange, cheerful poverty. They saw an authenticity, a sincerity that stood in stark contrast to the greed and ambition of their age. The first to join him was not a fellow beggar, but one of the most respected and wealthy men in Assisi, a nobleman named Bernard of Quintaval. Intrigued by Francis's transformation, Bernard invited him to his home. After a long night of conversation, Bernard was convinced. He wanted to join Francis in his life of poverty. But Francis, who was just as surprised as anyone, insisted they must first ask God for instructions. The next morning, Francis, Bernard, and another man, a canon lawyer named Peter Catanei, went to the church of St. Nicholas. This moment reveals the secret of the Franciscan Order's original DNA. Francis did not sit down and write a complex monastic rule like St. Benedict had. He believed the only rule they needed was the gospel itself, taken as literally as possible. He opened the gospel book on the altar 3 times at random. The first passage he turned to was from Matthew. "If you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." The second was from Luke. "Take nothing for your journey." And the third was from Matthew again. "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." For Francis, this was not allegory or metaphor. It was a direct divine command. Bernard of Quintaval, a man of immense wealth, took it literally. He immediately went out, sold all his vast properties, and distributed the entire proceeds to the poor in the public square. He then donned a simple tunic and joined Francis, a rich man who had chosen to become a beggar. Soon others followed. The canon Peter Catanei, a man of learning and status, gave up his position. A simple farmer named Giles joined them. A small brotherhood began to form around Francis, a strange and eclectic mix of rich and poor, learned and simple, all united by this single radical commitment. They called themselves the Fratres Minores, the Lesser Brothers. The name itself was a revolutionary statement. In the deeply hierarchical world of the Church, where monks were part of powerful landowning orders and priests held a special status, Francis deliberately placed his brotherhood at the very bottom. They were to be the servants of all the inferiors of everyone. Their mission was simple: to live the life of the apostles, to own absolutely nothing, and to go out into the world and preach a simple message of penance, peace, and love. Their way of life was a complete inversion of the values of their society. They had no monastery, no property, no security. They slept in abandoned hovels, leper colonies, or under the open sky. They worked with their hands alongside common laborers or peasants in the fields in exchange for food. And if work was not available, they would beg for their daily bread, an act that was deeply shameful for men of their former station. Francis insisted that they accept only food, never money. Money, he believed, was the ultimate poison, the dung of the devil. To touch a coin was to be corrupted by the very world they had renounced. But this life of extreme poverty was not one of grim, sorrowful asceticism. The secret to their explosive appeal was their profound and palpable joy. They were known for their singing, their humor, and a sense of cheerful liberation that astounded onlookers. They were God's jesters, playing a divine comedy in a world that took status and wealth so seriously. Thomas of Celano, Francis's first biographer, wrote that they were overflowing with joy. For them, the whole world was a source of delight. This scandalous joy, born of having nothing to lose, was their most powerful sermon. It suggested that true wealth was not found in possessions, but in their absence. Francis referred to their way of life as a holy matrimony to a new bride, the Lady Poverty. He wrote poems and sang songs in her honor. For him, poverty was not a negative state of deprivation. It was a positive virtue, a perfect freedom. To own nothing was to be free from the anxiety, the greed, and the violence that came with protecting property. It allowed them to be truly dependent on God's providence and the charity of their fellow human beings. This radical idea was, of course, a profound, if implicit, critique of the world around them. In an age when bishops lived like princes and great monasteries were among the largest and most powerful economic institutions in Europe, this small band of joyful beggars was a living, walking rebuke to the institutional church's wealth and power. They were not heretics. They never once questioned church doctrine. But their very existence was a challenge. They were holding up a mirror to Christendom, and the reflection was a deeply uncomfortable one. As their numbers grew, Francis knew that their strange and radical brotherhood could not survive on the margins forever. To protect his family from accusations of heresy, he knew he had to take the most audacious step yet to lead his band of ragged followers to the very heart of worldly power, to the court of the Pope in Rome, and ask the wealthiest and most powerful man in Christendom to approve a way of life based on owning absolutely nothing. The Pope's Gamble. In the year 1209, a strange and unsettling sight appeared on the streets of Rome. It was a small procession of 12 men, led by a charismatic figure with burning eyes. They were barefoot, emaciated, and dressed in rough, earth-colored tunics that looked more like sacks than clerical robes. They were dusty and dirty from their long walk from Assisi. To the sophisticated worldly prelates of the papal court, they must have looked like a band of vagrants or worse, dangerous fanatics. This was Francis and his first 11 followers, and they had come to the center of Christian power to ask for the impossible, for the Pope himself to approve their radical way of life. The Rome they entered was the capital of a church at the absolute zenith of its temporal power and wealth. The Pope was Innocent III, a man who saw himself not just as a spiritual leader, but as the master of Christendom, a king of kings, to whom even emperors owed fealty. The papal court housed in the magnificent Lateran Palace was a world of unimaginable splendor, Byzantine intrigue, and immense administrative power. It was a world of canon lawyers, of land grants, of tithes and taxes. Into this fortress of institutional wealth and legalism walked a dozen men who had sworn to own nothing, to touch no money, and whose only rule was the literal words of the gospel. It was a collision of two completely opposite worlds. Their request was presented to the cardinals and high officials of the Curia. The reaction was one of deep suspicion and hostility. The Church was already fighting a desperate war against numerous heretical movements that were spreading across Europe, particularly in southern France and northern Italy. Groups like the Waldensians and the Cathars also preached a return to apostolic poverty and often used their simple lifestyle as a sharp critique of the wealth and corruption of the clergy. To the learned cardinals, Francis's little band looked dangerously similar to these other groups. Their commitment to absolute poverty was seen not as holy, but as an implicit and dangerous rebuke to the Church's entire structure. Their lack of a formal written monastic rule was seen as a recipe for anarchy. The overwhelming advice given to Pope Innocent was to dismiss them, to condemn their way of life as impractical and unsafe, and to send them back to Assisi before their dangerous ideas could spread. But Innocent III was not just a powerful monarch. He was one of the most intelligent and politically astute men of his age. He understood something his more rigid advisors did not. He knew that the Church's immense wealth and power had created a spiritual vacuum among the common people. He knew that the laity was hungry for a more personal, more authentic, and more emotionally resonant form of faith. Crushing every grassroots spiritual movement that arose from this hunger was a losing battle. It was like playing a game of whack-a-mole. For every heresy he stamped out, two more would pop up. He was at risk of alienating the very people the Church was meant to serve. It is at this point that the famous story of the Pope's dream is told. The night after his first dismissive encounter with Francis, the Pope supposedly had a vision. He saw the great Basilica of St. John Lateran, the mother church of all Christendom, the very symbol of the Church's power and authority, beginning to lean its walls, cracking and about to collapse. And then in his dream he saw a small, poor, shabby-looking man step forward and place his own shoulder against the falling wall, pushing it back up and saving it from ruin. When the Pope awoke, he recognized the man in his dream as the ragged beggar from Assisi who had stood before him the day before. Whether the dream was a genuine divine revelation or a story invented later to add a mythic quality to the event, it captures a profound political truth. Innocent III, in a moment of brilliant insight, realized that Francis was not a threat to the Church. He was its potential savior. He saw that Francis's radicalism, if properly managed, was not a fire that would burn the Church down, but a controlled burn that could clear away the dead wood of public cynicism and allow for new growth. He understood that the best way to control a popular charismatic movement is not to crush it, but to co-opt it. In a second audience, he brought Francis and his brothers before him again. Instead of condemning them, he made a decision of stunning political genius. He would not give them a formal written approval that would be too risky and would require layers of legal review, but he would give them his personal verbal permission to continue their way of life and to preach penance. He made them all take the tonsure, the clerical haircut, which officially brought them under the authority of the Church. And he made Francis the formal head of the group, responsible directly to him. With these simple acts, Innocent III performed a masterful feat of political jiu-jitsu. He had taken a potentially dangerous, radical, and anti-institutional movement and brought it inside the tent. He had made Francis and his followers a legitimate part of the Church, but on his terms. They were now bound by obedience. Their energy and popular appeal would now serve the interests of the papacy, not challenge it. He had essentially created a new kind of army, a mobile, loyal force of preachers who could go where the parish priests could not, who could connect with the common people in a way the wealthy bishops never could. He had recognized that the Church's best defense against the heresy of poverty was to have its own officially sanctioned order of the poor. Francis and his brothers left Rome overjoyed. They had received the blessing of Christ's vicar on earth. They did not see the political genius of the Pope's move. They saw only a confirmation of their divine calling. They returned to Assisi with a newfound authority. They were no longer a band of eccentric beggars. They were a legitimate religious brotherhood approved by the highest power in Christendom. The Pope's gamble had been made. The revolution had been sanctioned. And now, with the blessing of Rome, the small stream of followers was about to become a tidal wave. The Women's Revolution, Clare of Assisi. The story of the Franciscan movement is often told as a story of men of Francis and his brothers. But to do so is to ignore half of the revolution. Running parallel to Francis's story is another equally radical and courageous tale, that of Clare of Assisi. Her struggle to live a life of absolute poverty as a woman reveals the unique challenges and the profound depth of the Franciscan ideal. She was not merely a follower of Francis. She was a co-founder, a leader in her own right, who fought a lifelong battle to ensure that the radical heart of his message would not be compromised. Clare Favarone was a world away from Francis. While he was the son of the nouveau riche, she was a member of Assisi's old aristocracy, a young noblewoman from one of the city's most powerful families. She was raised in a palace destined for a life of comfort and, most importantly, a strategic marriage that would further her family's power and influence. But from a young age, she was known for her deep piety and her secret acts of charity, smuggling food from her family's lavish table to the poor. She was captivated by the news of Francis's public conversion and the formation of his new brotherhood. She saw in his radical poverty and his joyful faith the authentic Christian life. She yearned for a life that stood in stark opposition to the gilded cage her family was preparing for her. She began to meet with Francis in secret, and under his spiritual guidance, she made a decision that was for a woman of her class even more scandalous than Francis's own renunciation. She would refuse the marriage her family was arranging for her and dedicate her life to God, not in a traditional wealthy convent, but in the new radical way of absolute poverty. On the night of Palm Sunday in 1212, Clare made her move. She was 18 years old. Dressed in her finest gown, she attended the evening service with her family. Then, under the cover of darkness, she fled her family's palace, accompanied by a cousin. She escaped not through the main door, but through the door of the dead, a narrow side entrance used only for carrying out coffins, a powerful symbol of her death to her old life. She ran through the woods to the portiuncula, the small chapel that served as the humble heart of Francis's new brotherhood. There, by the light of flickering torches, a dramatic ceremony took place. Francis and the brothers received her. In a profound act of renunciation, Francis himself took a pair of shears and cut off Clare's long, beautiful blonde hair, a symbol of her noble status and her worldly vanity. She traded her expensive gown for a rough, shapeless penitential robe. She had renounced her family, her wealth, her future marriage, and her social identity. She was now a bride of Christ, wedded like Francis to Lady Poverty. Her family was furious. For a daughter to defy her father's will and refuse an arranged marriage was a profound dishonor and a financial disaster. They stormed the Benedictine convent, where Francis had temporarily placed her for safety, trying to drag her home by force. They tore at her rough habit, revealing the coarse hair shirt she wore beneath. Clare fought back, clinging to the altar cloths, refusing to leave. To end the argument, she dramatically revealed her shorn head, making it clear to her family that she was no longer a marriageable commodity. She was irrevocably consecrated to God. Defeated, her family retreated. Soon after, her own sister Agnes joined her, as did other noble women of Assisi inspired by her example. Francis established this small community of women at the Church of San Damiano, the very chapel he had rebuilt with his own hands. This became the first community of what would be known as the Poor Ladies, and later, the Poor Clares, the second order of the Franciscan family. Their life was one of strict enclosure, silence, manual labor, and prayer. But it was their relationship with poverty that made them truly revolutionary. At this time, female monasteries were expected to be endowed institutions. For a community of women to survive, they needed the security of land property and rents. The idea of an enclosed convent of women living with no property and depending on daily alms was seen as reckless and dangerously insecure. The church hierarchy, including popes and cardinals, repeatedly tried to force Clare to accept endowments for San Damiano. They saw it as their duty to provide for these holy women. But for Clare, this was not a kindness. It was a threat to the very core of her vocation. Her entire life became a tenacious, lifelong struggle for what she called the privilegium paupertatis, the privilege of poverty. She did not want the privilege of being wealthy. She demanded the privilege of being allowed to own nothing. She wrote letters, she petitioned popes, she used all of her considerable intelligence and aristocratic connections to defend this central radical principle. For her, as for Francis, absolute poverty was not a hardship to be endured, but the very essence of a life lived in imitation of Christ and his poor mother. It was a perfect freedom, a total dependence on the providence of God. Just before her death in 1253, after decades of struggle, Pope Innocent IV finally and reluctantly approved the rule. She herself had written a rule that enshrined the principle of absolute poverty for her order. She had won. Clare's story is the crucial, often overlooked other half of the Franciscan Revolution. She proved that the radical ideal was not just for men wandering the roads, but could be lived out by women in a powerful, contemplative life of prayer and simplicity. She was not simply Francis's follower. She was his staunchest ally, the guardian of the flame of absolute poverty, a quiet revolutionary who fought and won a spiritual battle that would define the very soul of the movement for centuries to come. While Francis's brothers took his message to the world, Clare and her sisters became the silent beating heart of the movement, a powerhouse of prayer and a permanent living reminder of the radical idea born that night in the Portiuncula. An army of joyful beggars. With the blessing of the Pope secured and the powerful example of Clare and her sisters established, the Franciscan movement erupted. The small stream of followers that had trickled into the Portiuncula now became a human flood. The growth in the first few decades was explosive, a phenomenon that caught both Francis and the church hierarchy by surprise. Within Francis's own lifetime, the 12 brothers became over 5,000. They spread out from Italy across the Alps into France, Germany, England, and Spain. They were an army of joyful beggars, and they were conquering Europe not with the sword, but with the radical simplicity of their lives. The secret to their incredible appeal lay in how perfectly they met the spiritual needs of their time. The 13th century was an age of rising cities and a new urban population of merchants, artisans, and laborers. These people felt increasingly disconnected from the traditional structures of the church. The old great monasteries were often remote landowning institutions isolated from the bustle of city life. The local parish clergy were sometimes poorly educated or seen as distant tax-collecting administrators. The laity craved a more direct, more emotional, and more personal form of Christianity, and the Franciscans provided it in abundance. Their method of preaching was in itself a revolution. They did not stand in a pulpit and deliver complex theological sermons in Latin, a language the common person could not understand. They went to the people where they were, in the crowded town squares, in the bustling marketplaces, on the street corners. They spoke the vernacular, the everyday language of the people, and their message was simple, direct, and powerful: metanoia. The Greek word is often translated as repent, but its deeper meaning is to change your mind, to turn your life around. They called people to a life of peace, charity, and reconciliation. They used stories, humor, popular songs, and even dramatic gestures to communicate the gospel in a way that was accessible and deeply moving. They were master communicators, and the people responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. As the movement grew, Francis and his early companions realized that their all-or-nothing lifestyle was impossible for most people. A merchant could not abandon his family and his business to become a wandering beggar. A mother could not leave her children. To address this, Francis created his most far-reaching and socially transformative innovation, the Third Order, now known as the Secular Franciscans. This was a stroke of genius. It was a formal rule of life designed for laypeople, ordinary men and women who wanted to live by Franciscan principles while remaining in the world. Members of the Third Order, who came from all walks of life, from noblemen to humble craftsmen, took vows to live a life of simplicity, to pray daily, to attend Mass, and to practice works of charity. But the rule also contained clauses with profound social and political consequences. Members were forbidden from carrying weapons or swearing feudal oaths of military service. In a violent age where every lord demanded military loyalty from his subjects, this was a radical peace movement. It created a vast body of people who were conscientious objectors, undermining the very foundations of the feudal system of warfare. The Third Order took the core values of the Franciscan Revolution out of the hands of a spiritual elite and placed them into the heart of society. It created a vast international network of laypeople loyal to the Franciscan ideal, a grassroots army that gave the order immense influence and popular support. This explosive success, however, inevitably began to create friction. The friars, with their papal approval, were operating as a mobile international force, a spiritual army loyal directly to the Pope. They did not fit neatly into the established structure of the Church. They would arrive in a town, and with their popular preaching, would draw huge crowds, often to the chagrin of the local parish priest. They were also given papal permission to hear confessions, a duty that had traditionally been the sole right of the parish clergy. This meant they were not just taking the local priest's congregation, they were also taking away a source of his income, as penitents would give alms to the friars instead. This created deep resentment among the secular clergy. Bishops and priests began to complain that these wandering friars were encroaching on their territory, stealing their flocks, and undermining their authority. A fierce rivalry also developed with the other great new mendicant order, the Dominicans, founded by Saint Dominic around the same time. While the Franciscans focused on simplicity and preaching to the heart, the Dominicans focused on theological orthodoxy and preaching to the mind. They were both competing for the same resources: the souls of the laity, the donations of the wealthy, and positions of influence at the great universities. The army of joyful beggars was becoming a powerful and at times disruptive institution. Its very success was creating a set of complex new problems. The movement that had been founded on a rejection of all structure was now in desperate need of it. How do you feed and house thousands of friars across a dozen countries? How do you ensure a consistent quality of education and training? How do you manage the order's relationship with the bishops and the other clergy? These were questions that Francis, a man who thought in terms of spiritual relationships, not organizational charts, was ill-equipped to answer. His simple charismatic vision was colliding with the complex reality of running a global organization. The founder's ideal was about to be tested by the unstoppable success of his own creation, a crisis that would be brought to a head by his own fateful journey to the heart of the Crusades. The Saint and the Sultan. While the Franciscan Order was exploding across Europe, its founder was growing increasingly restless. The administrative burdens and the internal politics of his rapidly expanding brotherhood were a heavy weight on a man who had sought only a life of simple, humble service. But his greatest spiritual anxiety was directed outwards towards the great conflict of his age, the Crusades. Since the time of Pope Urban II, the Holy War to reclaim Jerusalem had been the central project of Christendom. For over a century, the best and bravest of Europe had marched to the east to fight the infidel. But Francis, in his radical reading of the Gospel, saw a profound contradiction. He could not reconcile the command to love your enemies with the reality of a holy war fought with sword and fire. He became possessed by a desire to go to the heart of the conflict, not as a soldier, but as a peacemaker. His goal was not to kill the Muslims, but to achieve what the Crusader armies could not, to convert them, and specifically to convert their leader. He believed that if he could just stand before the Sultan of Egypt, the most powerful Muslim ruler of the age, and preach the truth of the gospel, the Sultan's heart would be moved, the war would end, and the Holy Land would be won for Christ without any more bloodshed. It was a plan born of an almost unimaginable faith and a stunning political naivety. In 1219, his opportunity came. The Fifth Crusade was underway, its armies bogged down in a difficult siege of the Egyptian port city of Damietta. The Crusader camp was a sprawling, chaotic city of soldiers, pilgrims, and merchants, all focused on the military conquest of the Nile Delta. Into this camp of holy war walked Francis and a single companion, Brother Illuminato. His goal was not to join the fighting, but to do the unthinkable, to cross the battle lines and seek an audience with the enemy. The Sultan of Egypt was a man named Al-Kamil, a nephew of the great Saladin. He was a sophisticated, intelligent, and famously chivalrous ruler. When the Crusader knights in the camp heard of Francis's plan, they tried to stop him. They saw it as certain suicide. They assumed the infidels would torture and kill them on sight. But Francis was resolute. He saw this not as a danger, but as his chance for the ultimate prize he had long sought, martyrdom for the sake of Christ. He and Brother Illuminato walked out of the Crusader camp across the desolate no-man's land between the two armies and were immediately captured by Muslim soldiers. When they were brought before the guards, they simply announced, "I am a Christian. Take me to your master." Expecting to be executed, they were instead taken to the Sultan's campaign tent. Sultan Al-Kamil, intrigued by the appearance of these two strange, poor men, granted them an audience. The meeting that followed is one of the most remarkable and countercultural events of the entire medieval period. It was not a confrontation, but a dialogue. Al-Kamil did not torture Francis. He treated him as an honored guest. For several days, the two men engaged in a deep and respectful conversation about faith. Francis, with burning sincerity, preached the Christian gospel. Al-Kamil, a devout Muslim, listened patiently and responded by explaining the tenets of his own faith. According to the accounts, he was deeply impressed by Francis's courage and his profound, authentic faith. One story claims Francis even offered to undergo a trial by fire, to walk through flames to prove the truth of his beliefs, an offer the Sultan wisely declined. In the end, of course, Francis failed in his ultimate goal. The Sultan was not converted. The logic of theology and the reality of a holy war could not be overcome by the sincerity of one man. But the Sultan, far from executing him, was moved by his purity of heart. He offered Francis rich gifts, which Francis, true to his vow of poverty, politely refused. Al-Kamil then gave him safe passage with a military escort back to the Crusader camp. Francis returned not as a triumphant evangelist, but as a man who had borne witness to his faith in the most radical way imaginable. His mission had been a practical failure, but it was a profound spiritual and prophetic statement. At the very moment when the organized church was pouring all its resources into a military conflict between Christianity and Islam, Francis had demonstrated a completely different way. He had rejected the logic of the crusade and replaced it with a logic of personal encounter, peaceful dialogue, and mutual respect. He had walked unarmed into the heart of the enemy and found not a monster, but a man with whom he could speak of God. This journey to Egypt represents the pinnacle of Francis's own personal vision. It was the ultimate expression of his literal, fearless, and deeply countercultural faith. But while he was in the East, pursuing this dream of peaceful conversion, the order he had created back in Europe was undergoing a profound transformation. The pressures of its own explosive growth were forcing it to become more structured, more organized, and more integrated into the very power structures of the Church that Francis had sought to renounce. He would return from his personal spiritual quest to face the greatest crisis of his life, the battle for the soul of his own brotherhood. The agony of the founder. Francis returned from his daring mission in Egypt in 1220 to a brotherhood in crisis. His journey to the East had been an attempt to live out his purest, most personal ideal of the apostolic life. But while he was gone, the order he had founded had grown far beyond his control, and the Franciscan problem had become a major concern for the papal court. With thousands of friars now spread across Europe, many of them uneducated and lacking proper guidance, the movement was becoming dangerously decentralized. The Pope and the more pragmatic leaders within the order knew that this charismatic chaos could not continue. The revolution had to be organized. The men Francis had left in charge, his vicars, had already begun this process. They had started to legislate to create rules and structures that directly contradicted Francis's original vision. They pushed for the order to have permanent houses and for the friars to pursue formal theological studies at the great universities. They argued that for the brothers to be effective preachers and to combat the sophisticated arguments of heretics, they needed education and stable communities to work from. To them, this was a matter of practical necessity. For Francis, it was a betrayal. He had envisioned a brotherhood of simple, unlettered men who would teach by their example of humility, not by the power of their intellect. He saw formal houses as a stepping stone to owning property, the very thing he had forbidden. He returned to find his simple, spirit-led movement being transformed into a structured, monastic-style institution. It was the beginning of his greatest personal agony. He was the founder, the charismatic heart of the movement, but he was not an administrator. He had no skill for or interest in creating the complex legal and organizational framework that a global order now required. He was forced into the role of a lawgiver, a position he never wanted. Under immense pressure from the Pope and from the more moderate faction within his own order, he was compelled to draft a new, more formal rule. The Rule of 1223, which was officially approved by Pope Honorius III, is a document of painful compromise. It still speaks of poverty and the gospel life, but it is a much more structured and legalistic document than his original simple command to live like the apostles. It solidified the internal hierarchy of the order with ministers and provincials and laid the groundwork for a more settled institutional existence. For the Church, it was a necessary step to bring order to the movement. For Francis, it felt like a defeat. He felt that the pure, radical spirit of the Portiuncula was being diluted, caged within the paragraphs of canon law. His profound disillusionment led him to take a radical step in 1220, even before the new rule was finalized. He officially resigned as the head of the Order of Friars Minor. He appointed another man, Peter Catani, as his vicar, effectively becoming a simple brother within the massive organization he had created. He could no longer bear to govern a movement that was drifting so far from his own heart. In the autumn of 1294, a weary and ailing Francis, seeking solace and a return to his spiritual roots, retreated to the remote mountain of Laverna in the Tuscan Apennines. He went with a few of his most trusted early companions for a 40-day period of fasting and prayer in preparation for the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel. He was in deep spiritual turmoil, grieving for what he saw as the betrayal of his ideal of Lady Poverty. He prayed with an intense, agonizing fervor, asking to share in the suffering that Christ had endured on the cross. According to his companions and his earliest biographers, it was here on the lonely peak of La Verna that the most profound and mysterious event of his life occurred. One morning, around the feast of the exaltation of the cross, Francis was deep in prayer when he saw a vision. A figure of a six-winged seraph, a fiery angel of the highest order, descended from the heavens, and crucified within the wings of the angel was the figure of Christ himself. The vision was one of both ecstatic beauty and immense pain. As Francis gazed upon it, he felt a mixture of overwhelming joy and profound sorrow. When the vision faded, he discovered that a miraculous transformation had happened to his own body. On his hands and feet were the dark, fleshy wounds of the nails of the crucifixion. The nail heads, according to eyewitnesses, were black and round on the palms of his hands and the tops of his feet, while the sharp, bent points of the nails seemed to protrude from the other side, as if they had been driven through and clinched. And on his right side was a long red wound like that from a spear, which often bled, staining his tunic. Francis had received the stigmata, the 5 sacred wounds of Christ. This was an unprecedented event in Christian history. No one had ever before been recorded as physically bearing the marks of the Passion. The stigmata was a profound mystery. For his followers, it was the ultimate divine seal of approval on his life. It was God's sign that Francis had so perfectly conformed his own life to the life of Christ that he now physically shared in his suffering. It made him an alter Christus, another Christ. For Francis himself, it was a source of both spiritual consolation and immense physical pain. He tried to hide the wounds wearing cloths over his hands and feet, but he could not conceal them from his closest companions. He would carry these wounds, this agonizing, sacred mystery, for the last 2 years of his life. The agony of the founder was now complete. He was a man who had lost control of his own creation, seeing his brotherhood of joyful beggars become a complex institution. And he was a man whose body was now a living testament to the suffering of the crucified Christ he had sought to imitate. The stigmata was the final terrible and beautiful sign of his success as a saint and his failure as the leader of a worldly organization. The testament and the betrayal. For the last 2 years of his life, Francis was a man physically and spiritually broken. The sacred wounds of the stigmata caused him constant, agonizing pain. He was also going blind and suffered from numerous other ailments. He was carried from place to place on a litter, a living relic, the holy man of Assisi, who bore the marks of Christ himself. But even as his body failed, his spiritual vision remained as radical and uncompromising as ever. In his final months, living in a simple hut near the convent of San Damiano, cared for by Claire and her sisters, he composed his 2 final masterpieces, one a song of universal love, the other a desperate final command. The first was his famous poem, The Canticle of the Sun, or Canticle of the Creatures. Dictated in his sickness and blindness, It is a stunning departure from the typical medieval mindset that often viewed the material world as a source of temptation and sin. Instead, Francis composed a joyous hymn of praise for God's creation, giving familial names to the elements. He praised Brother Sun and Sister Moon, Brother Wind and Sister Water. Most remarkably, in his final days, he added a verse praising Sister Death, welcoming her as the gentle gateway to eternal life. The canticle was the ultimate expression of his worldview, a universe where all of creation, sun, moon, animals, and even death was part of a single holy family, all worthy of love and praise. But as he faced his own mortality, he was also consumed by anxiety for the future of his brotherhood. He knew that the forces of institutionalization and compromise were already winning. He saw the order building permanent houses, accumulating books, and seeking privileges and exemptions from the Pope. He saw the simple, humble spirit of the early days being replaced by the ambitions of a great religious corporation. In a last desperate attempt to preserve the original radical heart of his movement, he dictated his final will and testament. The testament is one of the most powerful and poignant documents in religious history. It is not a legal document, but a passionate, personal, and at times angry plea from a dying founder to his sons. He recounts the story of his own conversion, his service to the lepers, and the divine command to live according to the gospel. And then he lays down a series of strict commands or admonitions. He forbids his followers from seeking any letters of privilege from the papal court, for any reason, whether for a church or for protection. He commands them to not seek intellectual explanations, or to water down the rule, but to live it simply and without gloss. And above all, he returns again and again to his central foundational principle, absolute poverty, both for the individual friars and for the brotherhood as a whole. The testament was his final heartfelt attempt to chain his order forever to his beloved Lady Poverty. In early October of 1226, feeling that his own sister Death was approaching, Francis asked to be taken back to the Portiuncula, the tiny chapel where the movement had begun. He wanted to die at the humble heart of his brotherhood. He asked the brothers to lay him on the bare earth, stripped of his tunic, so that he could die in a final act of imitation of his naked, crucified Lord. As his brothers wept, he blessed them, and then he died, listening to a reading of the Passion story from the Gospel of John. The moment Francis's body grew cold, the battle for his legacy began. The man who had lived his life in a radical rejection of worldly honor was immediately seized upon as a symbol of immense civic and religious prestige. The people of Assisi, fearing that the rival city of Perugia would try to steal his holy body, sent an armed guard to bring his remains back into the city. He was no longer just Francis. He was now a sacred relic, a source of spiritual power, and more practically, a future source of immense pilgrimage revenue. The man who took control of the order after Francis's death was Brother Elias of Cortona. Elias was a brilliant organizer, a master administrator, and a man with a grand vision for the Franciscan Order, a vision that was the complete antithesis of Francis's own. He saw the order as a powerful new force in the Church, and he believed it needed magnificent buildings and a powerful central administration to reflect its new status. Almost immediately, he began to make plans for the construction of a massive double-decker basilica in Assisi, to serve as a glorious shrine for the body of the Saint of Poverty. This project was a direct and deliberate defiance of everything Francis had written in his testament. The leaders of the order, including Brother Elias, were now faced with a serious problem, the inconvenient last wishes of their own sainted founder. The testament was a powerful moral and spiritual document that directly forbade the very institutionalization they believed was necessary. So they went to Rome. In 1230, just 4 years after Francis's death, Pope Gregory IX, a personal friend and protector of Francis, issued a papal bull titled Quo Elongati. In this document, the Pope made a fateful legal declaration. He announced that Francis's testament was not a legally binding rule, but merely a personal expression of his spiritual advice. It had no binding force on the brothers. With this single papal decree, the final command of Saint Francis was legally nullified. The door was now wide open for the transformation of the order. The pragmatists had won. The construction of the great basilica could proceed. The acquisition of property, the building of large convents, the establishment of formal schools, all of it was now permissible. The great betrayal of the testament was complete. Francis had been dead for less than 5 years, and the battle lines for the civil war that would tear his brotherhood apart were already drawn. On one side stood the memory and the written command of the founder. On the other stood the power of the Pope and the unstoppable logic of a global institution. The Franciscan Civil War. With the Pope's annulment of the testament, the Franciscan Order was set on a path of inevitable conflict. The two opposing visions for the movement, which had been a source of tension during Francis's own lifetime, now erupted into an open and bitter civil war. This was not a war fought with swords, but with ideas, papal decrees, and acts of persecution. It was a struggle for the very soul of the Franciscan ideal, a battle between the memory of the founder and the needs of the institution. Over the next century, the Brotherhood would be torn apart by two warring factions, the spirituals and the conventuals. The conventual party, also known as the Community, represented the pragmatic institutional future of the order. They were led by men like Brother Elias, and later the great theologian Saint Bonaventure. Their argument was one of practical necessity. The order they contended had grown far too large and influential to survive as a scattered band of homeless beggars. To fulfill its mission of preaching, teaching, and serving the Church on a global scale, it needed structure. It needed permanent houses or convents from which they got their name to live and study in. It needed well-stocked libraries to train its preachers to combat heresy. It needed grand churches to accommodate the huge crowds that flocked to hear them. All of this required land buildings and money. They argued that they could still adhere to Francis's ideal of personal poverty by vesting the legal ownership of all this property in the hands of the Pope, while the friars merely had the use of it. It was a clever legal fiction, a way to have their cake and eat it too, and it allowed them to build the powerful international organization that the papacy so desired. On the other side stood the spirituals. They were the uncompromising idealists, the fundamentalists of the movement. They saw the conventuals' arguments not as pragmatism, but as a cowardly betrayal of the founder's most sacred principles. For them, Francis's life and his testament were absolute. They believed that the vow of poverty was not just for the individual friar, but for the entire brotherhood. The order as a collective should own nothing. They rejected the legal fictions about use as a lawyer's trick to circumvent the clear command of their sainted founder. They saw the magnificent new basilica rising in Assisi, not as a shrine, but as a tombstone, a monument to the death of the true Franciscan spirit. They sought a return to the early days of the movement, to the simple life of the portiuncula, to a life of manual labor, begging, and radical insecurity. The first great battle was fought over the body of Francis itself. When the basilica was nearing completion in 1230, Brother Elias knew that the spirituals and the common people of Assisi, who revered Francis as their own local saint, might resist his plan to entomb him in a grand papal-controlled church. In a clandestine pre-dawn operation, Elias had the saint's body moved from its temporary resting place and secretly interred in a stone sarcophagus deep within a hidden crypt carved into the rock beneath the lower church. The location was kept a secret, effectively making the body the prisoner of the very institution being built in its name. The spirituals were outraged, seeing this as the ultimate act of appropriation. As the 13th century progressed, the conventual faction, with the full backing of the Pope and the church hierarchy, consolidated its power. The order became a dominant force at the great universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. A new generation of Franciscan leaders emerged, men like Saint Bonaventure, who became Minister General of the order. Bonaventure was a brilliant theologian and a good man, but he was also an administrator tasked with bringing unity to a fractured brotherhood. He wrote a new official biography of Saint Francis, which downplayed the founder's more radical and anti-clerical aspects. He then, in an act that can only be described as Orwellian, ordered all previous biographies of Francis to be destroyed in an attempt to create a single sanitized official version of the founder's life. But the spirituals refused to be silenced. They were driven underground, but their movement continued to thrive, particularly in the remote hermitages of Italy and the volatile regions of southern France. They saw the official institutionalized order as the Church of the Flesh, and themselves as the Church of the Spirit. Their movement became increasingly radical and apocalyptic. Influenced by the prophetic writings of a mystic named Joachim of Fiore, many spirituals began to see Francis not just as a saint, but as the herald of a new age of the Spirit, an age that would see the corrupt, wealthy institutional church overthrown and replaced by a new, purely spiritual church of the poor, a church led by them. This was a direct and dangerous challenge to the papacy. The conflict was no longer just an internal dispute. It was verging on open heresy. The conventual leadership, seeing the spirituals as a threat to the entire order, began to actively persecute them. Spiritual Franciscans were denounced, their leaders were arrested and imprisoned by their own brothers. Friars who refused to live in the large convents and continued to preach a radical doctrine of poverty were harassed and exiled. The brotherhood, founded on the principle of universal love, was now devouring its own. The joyous army of beggars had split into two warring camps, one a powerful and successful arm of the established church, and the other a hunted radical fringe. The Pope, seeing this endless conflict, would soon be forced to intervene in the most dramatic way possible, with a final brutal decision that would turn a faction of Francis's most fervent followers into official heretics destined for the Inquisitor's flames. The heresy of humility. By the early 14th century, the long and bitter civil war within the Franciscan Order had reached a breaking point. The conflict had moved beyond a simple disagreement over lifestyle and had become a profound theological battle that threatened the very foundations of the Church itself. The central explosive question was this: did Jesus Christ and his apostles own anything? To the spiritual Franciscans, the answer was an absolute and non-negotiable no. They championed the doctrine of the absolute poverty of Christ, arguing that Jesus and his followers had lived a life entirely without property, either individually or in common. For them, this was not just a historical fact. It was the model for all true Christian life. To live like Christ was to live in absolute poverty. This doctrine, which seemed so pious on the surface, was in reality a theological atom bomb. If Christ, the head of the Church, owned nothing, then it implicitly followed that his Church on earth, led by the Pope, should also own nothing. It was a radical spiritual argument that served as a devastating critique of the immense wealthland and temporal power of the 14th century papacy. The spirituals' insistence on the poverty of Christ was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Church of the Flesh, with its prince-bishops, its vast estates, and its lavish papal court at Avignon. The popes of the late 13th century had tried to walk a fine line tolerating the more moderate factions, while occasionally cracking down on the most extreme elements. But in 1316, the papal throne was ascended by a man with no patience for such theological subtleties, Pope John XIII. He was a former lawyer and a brilliant administrator, but he was also an authoritarian ruler who saw the spiritual Franciscans and their doctrine of absolute poverty not as a source of spiritual renewal, but as a direct, insolent threat to his authority. He was determined to crush the movement once and for all. His first move was to demand absolute obedience. He ordered the remaining spirituals to cease their criticisms, to abandon their separate, austere lifestyle, and to submit completely to the authority of the conventual leadership of the order. Those who refused were immediately branded as disobedient heretics. In southern France, a group of spirituals who defiantly continued to wear their shorter, squared-off habits as a sign of their commitment to a stricter poverty were arrested. 4 of them were handed over to the Holy Inquisition, tried, and in a horrifying spectacle were burned at the stake in Marseille in 1318. Franciscans were now being executed for being too Franciscan. But Pope John XXIII knew that to truly destroy the movement, he had to attack not just the men, but the idea itself. He assembled a commission of theologians to debate the core doctrine of apostolic poverty. The debate raged with the mainstream Franciscans and the rival Dominican order arguing against the spirituals' radical claims. The Minister General of the Franciscan Order at the time, Michael of Cesena, tried to find a middle ground, but the tide was turning against the idealists. Then, between 1322 and 1323, the Pope delivered the final decisive blow. He issued a series of powerful papal bulls, formal decrees, that would settle the matter with the full weight of papal infallibility. In Ad Conditorum Canonum, he brilliantly dismantled the legal fiction that had allowed the order to prosper. He renounced the papacy's ownership of all Franciscan property, effectively forcing the order to take legal responsibility for its own vast holdings. They could no longer pretend to be poor while living in rich convents owned by the Pope. And then came the theological hammer blow. In the bull Cum Inter non nullos, Pope John XXIX declared that the assertion that Christ and his apostles did not have anything, or that they did not have the right to sell them or give them away, is a perverse and erroneous assertion, and it is to be considered heretical. This was the ultimate tragic irony. The central ideal upon which Francis had founded his brotherhood, the imitation of Christ's absolute poverty, was now officially a heresy condemned by the very papal authority he had so humbly sought. The spiritual Franciscans were no longer just a disobedient faction. They were enemies of the faith. The movement was shattered. Michael of Cesena, the Minister General, along with other leading Franciscan thinkers, like the brilliant William of Ockham, were forced to flee the papal court, in terror seeking refuge, with the Pope's political enemy, the Holy Roman Emperor. The remaining spirituals were hunted down by the Inquisition. Many recanted under pressure. Those who refused to abandon their belief in the poverty of Christ were imprisoned or met their end in the flames. The revolution that had begun with a joyful beggar in Assisi had ended in a papal decree and the smoke of the Inquisitor's pyre. The institutional church had won the war. It had successfully tamed the wild, unpredictable energy of its founder and crushed the wing of the movement that sought to preserve his most radical vision. The Franciscan Order was now a fully integrated, wealthy, and powerful arm of the Church, a far cry from the small band of homeless brothers who had gathered at the Portiuncula. The battle for Francis's soul seemed to be over, and the pragmatists had claimed total victory. But an idea once unleashed can never be fully destroyed. While the conventual Franciscans were building their great churches and running the Inquisition, Another unforeseen revolution was quietly brewing within their own ranks. The very tools they had embraced to become a powerful institution, formal education, and engagement with the world of ideas, were about to produce a legacy that was in its own way just as revolutionary as the poverty they had abandoned. The fire of the spirituals had been extinguished, but a new intellectual fire was being lit in the universities of England, a fire that would illuminate the path to a new age of science and reason. The Friars' Telescope, the scientific legacy. While the Franciscan Order was being torn apart by the battle over poverty, a quieter and perhaps ultimately more world-changing revolution was taking place in the hushed halls of Europe's new universities. The victorious conventual faction had argued that for the order to be effective, it needed to be educated. To preach compellingly and to combat the sophisticated arguments of heretics, the friars needed to be masters of theology and philosophy. This necessity drove the Franciscans to establish themselves as a dominant intellectual force at the great centers of learning, particularly at the nascent universities of Paris and, most importantly, Oxford. And it was here in the cold, damp climate of England that the Franciscan mind, freed from the all-consuming debate over poverty, produced an astonishing and unforeseen legacy. It helped lay the philosophical groundwork for the modern scientific method. This seems like a paradox. How could a religious order born from a founder who was famously skeptical of book learning become a cradle for scientific thought? The secret lies in a unique aspect of Francis's own spirituality. Unlike some forms of medieval Christianity that viewed the physical world with suspicion as a mere distraction from the spiritual realm, Francis saw the material world as a holy text in itself. His Canticle of the Sun, with its praise for brother sun and sister water, was a celebration of the goodness and inherent worth of God's creation. This deep-seated belief that the physical world was good and worthy of study instilled in his intellectual followers a profound curiosity about how that world actually worked. To study nature was another way to understand the mind of God. The first great figure in this tradition was Robert Grosseteste, an English scholar, who became the first chancellor of Oxford University and a great lecturer to the Franciscan friars there. Grosseteste was obsessed with light or optics. He saw light as the first form of creation, the physical manifestation of God's divine energy. He conducted experiments with lenses and mirrors, studying the principles of reflection and refraction. He developed a systematic theory of experimental science, arguing that to gain true knowledge, one must start with an observation, formulate a hypothesis, and then conduct experiments to test it. This cyclical process, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, is the very essence of the scientific method. Grosseteste's most brilliant and famous student was a Franciscan friar named Roger Bacon. Bacon was a true polymath, a cantankerous and visionary genius who took his teacher's ideas and pushed them to their limits. He was a tireless advocate for empiricism, the belief that true knowledge comes not from blindly accepting the authority of ancient texts like Aristotle, but from direct hands-on experience and experimentation. Sine experientia nihil sufficienter scire potest. Without experience, nothing can be sufficiently known, he wrote. He was a relentless critic of the deductive, logic-based scholasticism that dominated the universities, arguing that an ounce of direct observation was worth more than a pound of philosophical debate. Bacon's own work was breathtaking in its scope. He was a pioneer in the field of optics, building on Grosseteste's work. He understood the principles of magnification and is credited with being one of the first to describe a formula for creating a telescope. He studied astronomy, calling for a reform of the inaccurate Julian calendar. He was a master of languages and a pioneer in cryptography, and he was a prophet of technology. In his writings, he made a series of astonishing predictions, envisioning a future with cars that can be made to move with incredible speed without the help of any animal, flying machines, and great bridges spanning rivers without any columns. He was a man dreaming of the modern world, and he believed that the key to unlocking it was a new kind of knowledge, a scientia experimentalis, or experimental science. This new intellectual current was given its philosophical razor's edge by a later Franciscan thinker, William of Ockham. Ockham is famous for the principle now known as Occam's razor. The principle states that when presented with competing hypotheses, one should always select the one that makes the fewest new assumptions. In other words, the simplest explanation is usually the best one. While it sounds simple, this was a profoundly revolutionary tool. In the medieval world, explanations for natural phenomena were often incredibly complex, involving layers of theological and metaphysical reasoning. Occam's razor was a tool for intellectual simplicity. It helped to sever the unnecessary ties between theology and the study of the natural world. It allowed thinkers to look for natural observable causes for natural events, without having to construct a complex supernatural explanation. It was a crucial step in separating the domain of faith from the domain of what would become science. The Franciscan intellectual tradition therefore produced a powerful trinity of ideas that would be essential for the scientific revolution centuries later. From Francis himself, they inherited a deep love and respect for the natural world. From Grosseteste and Bacon, they developed the methodology of empiricism and experimentation, and from Occam, they received the philosophical tool to pursue simpler, more naturalistic explanations. This was perhaps the greatest and most unexpected legacy of the Order's institutionalization. In the battle for Francis's soul, the conventuals had won, and in doing so, they had embraced the world of education and ideas. This decision, which seemed like a betrayal of the founders' simplicity, paradoxically gave rise to a new and powerful way of understanding God's creation. The friars who looked through telescopes to study the stars were in their own way following the path of their founder, who had found God by looking at the sun and the moon. They had simply found a new, more powerful way to see. This intellectual legacy would combine with another equally surprising one, the development of a new way of thinking about the world of money. The bankers of God. The Franciscan Order was born from a dramatic and public rejection of money. Francis saw wealth not just as a distraction, but as the dung of the devil, the root of all violence, greed, and corruption. The absolute prohibition against touching coins was one of the cornerstones of his original brotherhood. It is therefore the greatest and most fascinating paradox of the Order's history that its members would go on to become some of the most sophisticated and influential economic thinkers of the Middle Ages, developing theories that would help to legitimize the world of commerce and lay the moral groundwork for the rise of capitalism. This transformation was born out of the same necessity that drove them into the universities. As the Franciscan friars became the most popular and effective preachers in the burgeoning cities of Europe, they were living and working in the very heart of the new market economy. Their congregations were not feudal lords and peasants, but merchants, bankers, artisans, and tradesmen. To give these people meaningful spiritual guidance, the friars had to grapple with the complex moral and ethical questions of their daily lives. Is it a sin to make a profit? Is it just to charge interest on a loan? How does a good Christian live and work in a world increasingly defined by money? The central economic problem of the age was the Church's strict prohibition against usury, the lending of money at any interest. This doctrine, based on passages in the Bible, had made sense in a simple agrarian economy. But in the dynamic commercial world of 13th and 14th century Italy, it was a massive obstacle. Commerce runs on credit. A merchant needs a loan to buy goods in one city to sell in another. An artisan needs capital to buy raw materials. The Church's ban meant that this essential economic activity was largely in the hands of non-Christian lenders, or was conducted through complex and often dishonest loopholes. The Franciscan thinkers saw that for their merchant flock to thrive, they needed a new, more sophisticated economic theology. They began to develop a series of brilliant arguments that chipped away at the absolute prohibition on usury. Thinkers like Peter John Olivi, a Franciscan from the late 13th century, made a crucial distinction. He argued that when a merchant lends money, he is not just lending the principal, he is also giving up the potential profit he could have made with that money himself, lucrum cessans, and taking on a risk that it might not be paid back periculum sortis. Therefore, Olivi argued it was morally just for the lender to charge a modest additional fee to compensate for this lost potential and this risk. This was not the sin of usury. It was a legitimate return on a risky investment. This single idea was a conceptual breakthrough that helped to make the world of finance morally acceptable for Christians. Other Franciscan scholars, particularly a group known as the School of Salamanca in later centuries, would build on these ideas. They developed theories of supply and demand, the subjective nature of value, and the just price. They moved away from the old idea that an object had a single fixed objective value, arguing instead that the just price was whatever was agreed upon by a willing buyer and a willing seller in a common market. They were in essence describing the principles of a free market economy centuries before Adam Smith. But their economic work was not just theoretical. It had a profound and practical impact on the lives of the poor. The Franciscans saw firsthand how the prohibition on usury had a devastating effect on the most vulnerable. When a poor person needed a small loan to buy seeds for planting or to survive a bad harvest, their only option was often a predatory, unlicensed moneylender who would charge exorbitant, ruinous rates of interest. To combat this social evil, the Franciscans invented a revolutionary new institution, the Monte di Pietà, or Mount of Piety. The first Monte di Pietà was founded in Perugia, Italy, in 1462 by a Franciscan friar. It was in essence a non-profit charitable pawnshop. It was funded by donations from wealthy patrons and was designed to provide small, short-term loans to the poor at a very low administrative rate of interest, just enough to cover the operating costs of the institution. A poor person could bring a small object of value, a piece of clothing, a cooking pot as collateral, and receive a small loan to get them through a difficult time. This provided a vital lifeline for the working poor, protecting them from the loan sharks who would otherwise trap them in a cycle of debt. The idea was wildly successful and spread rapidly across Italy and the rest of Europe, becoming one of the most important and enduring social innovations of the late Middle Ages. The Franciscans had achieved a remarkable synthesis. They had reconciled their founders' deep concern for the poor with the economic realities of the new commercial world. They had moved from a simple, absolute rejection of money to a highly sophisticated engagement with it. They developed a moral framework that condemned the exploitation of the poor through usury, while simultaneously justifying the profits and credit that were essential for a healthy market economy. This economic legacy is one of the great secrets of Franciscan history. The order that began with a man stripping naked to renounce all ties to his father's business had, through its intellectual engagement with the world, become a key architect of the very economic system that would come to dominate Western civilization. Their journey from the absolute poverty of Francis to the complex economic theories of the Salamanca school is a testament to the order's incredible adaptability. Having conquered the worlds of popular spirituality and university, thought their friars were now poised to carry their complex and evolving mission to the furthest corners of the globe as they prepared to follow the conquistadors into a new world. The Cross in the New World. By the end of the 15th century, the Franciscan Order had become a disciplined global organization, a loyal and effective instrument of the papacy. Its internal battles had largely subsided, and its friars were renowned as preachers, scholars, and administrators. It was at this moment that the world itself suddenly expanded. The voyages of Columbus and other explorers revealed two vast, previously unknown continents, and the Church was faced with its greatest missionary challenge in 1,000 years, the evangelization of the Americas. The Franciscans, with their global structure, their history of missionary work, and their commitment to working with the common people, were perfectly positioned to be the shock troops of this new spiritual conquest. They arrived in the New World in the shadow of the conquistadors. As figures like Hernán Cortés were brutally dismantling the Aztec Empire with steel and gunpowder, the friars followed close behind, armed with the cross and the catechism. In 1524, the legendary 12 Apostles of Mexico, a hand-picked group of Franciscan friars, arrived in the newly conquered Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City. Their arrival was a piece of deliberate theater. They walked barefoot from the coast in their simple patched brown robes, a stark contrast to the armored mounted conquistadors. This act of humility immediately impressed the defeated indigenous population, who saw in the friars a different kind of power from that of the violent soldiers who had destroyed their world. The Franciscans' mission, as they saw it, was to save souls, and to do this, they believed they first had to obliterate the old religions, which they saw as a demonic web of idolatry and human sacrifice. They became agents of a profound cultural war. They oversaw the smashing of idols, the burning of sacred indigenous texts, and the destruction of temples and pyramids, often building their own churches directly on the foundations of these raised holy sites. It was a policy of spiritual replacement, an attempt to erase an entire religious worldview and substitute it with their own. From a modern perspective, it was an act of immense cultural destruction. But from their 16th century perspective, they were liberating a people from the tyranny of the devil. Yet this simple picture of the friar as a willing agent of empire is complicated by the Franciscans' other equally important role, that of protector of the indigenous peoples. The friars quickly saw that the greed and brutality of the Spanish colonists and the encomienda system, a form of serfdom that was slavery in all but name, was the single greatest obstacle to genuine conversion. How could they preach the love of a merciful God to a people who were being worked to death, tortured and murdered by men who called themselves Christians? This created a deep and often dangerous conflict. Many Franciscan friars became the most vocal and powerful critics of Spanish colonial policy. They used their considerable authority to stand up to the conquistadors, the governors and the landowners, denouncing their cruelty and exploitation. Figures like Bishop Juan de Zumárraga, the first bishop of Mexico and a Franciscan, used his office to defend the natives from the abuses of the colonial administration, earning him the title Protector of the Indians. They established schools and hospitals for the indigenous population and fought often unsuccessfully to have laws passed in Spain to protect them from the worst excesses of the colonists. They were caught in a profound moral paradox. They were part of the very colonial system whose abuses they were fighting against. This paradoxical role led to one of the most remarkable intellectual projects of the era. A number of friars realized that to truly convert the native peoples, to preach to them effectively, and to root out their old beliefs, they first had to understand their world on a profound level. This required a deep dive into the language, culture, religion, and social structure of the conquered peoples. The greatest of these Franciscan ethnographers was a friar named Bernardino de Sahagún. Sahagún spent over 50 years in Mexico, and he dedicated his life to a single monumental project, creating a complete encyclopedia of Aztec life and belief. Working with a team of elderly Aztec nobles and young trilingual students, he conducted a massive series of interviews. He meticulously documented their theology, their history, their social customs, their understanding of the natural world, their language Nahuatl, and their art. The result was the Florentine Codex, a 12-volume masterpiece, written in parallel columns of Spanish and Nahuatl, and illustrated by Aztec artists. Sahagún's motive was evangelization. He saw his work as a tool to help future missionaries understand the pagan mindset in order to better eradicate it. But the result was the single most important and comprehensive record of a lost civilization ever created. In his zeal to understand his enemy, he had inadvertently become its greatest preserver. He and other friars like him saved a world of knowledge from complete oblivion. Their work allows us to hear the voices of the Aztec people in their own language, to understand their world through their own eyes. It is a legacy of staggering importance born from the complex, morally ambiguous reality of the Franciscan mission in the New World. The friars of the Americas embodied the ultimate Franciscan paradox. They were agents of a destructive cultural conquest, and yet they were often the only voices crying out for justice for the conquered. They were spiritual imperialists who became pioneering ethnographers. They sought to erase a culture, and in the process became its most important archivists. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is rarely a simple story of good versus evil. The same institution, and sometimes the same individuals, could be both a part of the problem and the only available solution, wielding the cross in one hand and a shield in the other. The enduring paradox. But even as the order itself fractured, its impact on the wider culture continued to deepen. One of the most beautiful and lasting legacies of the Franciscan movement can be seen not in a text, but on the walls of their great churches. The Franciscan emphasis on the humanity of Christ, on Jesus as a vulnerable baby in the manger, as a man who felt sorrow and pain, as a suffering figure on the cross, created a new kind of emotional, empathetic spirituality. This new focus demanded a new kind of art. The great painter Giotto di Bondone, who worked at the end of the 13th century, is often called the father of the Renaissance, and his genius was inextricably linked to the Franciscan spirit. His masterpiece is the stunning fresco cycle on the walls of the Upper Basilica in Assisi, depicting the life of Saint Francis. Here, for the first time, biblical and saintly figures are not the stiff, flat, otherworldly icons of the Byzantine style. They are real, three-dimensional human beings. They have weight, they cast shadows, and most importantly, they express profound, recognizable human emotion. You can see the grief in the faces of the weeping Poor Clares, the joy of Francis preaching to the birds, the agony of his stigmata. Giotto was painting the Franciscan message that the divine is found not in some remote abstract heaven, but here on earth in the real, emotional, and often painful experiences of human life. This humanism, this focus on the individual and the real, was a direct precursor to the artistic explosion of the Renaissance. This multifaceted legacy, spiritual, intellectual, economic, and artistic, demonstrates the enduring paradox of the Franciscan story. The order survived and thrived precisely because it allowed itself to be transformed. The raw, uncontrollable, and perhaps unsustainable radicalism of the founder was channeled and institutionalized, poured into different containers that allowed its energy to reshape the world in countless unexpected ways. The simple command to rebuild my church was interpreted first as rebuilding a stone chapel, then as renewing the soul of the laity, then as constructing great universities and intellectual traditions, and finally as building a global missionary enterprise. Today, that legacy continues. The spirit of Francis lives on in the tens of thousands of Franciscan friars, sisters, and laypeople around the world. It is found in their service to the poor and the marginalized in soup kitchens and homeless shelters. It is found in their commitment to social justice and peacemaking, a direct echo of Francis walking into the Sultan's camp. And it is found in a new and urgent context, the care for the environment. In 1979, Pope John Paul II declared Saint Francis the patron saint of ecology, recognizing that the man who preached to brother sun and sister water was a prophet of environmental consciousness, a man who saw all of creation as a sacred family. The most powerful modern echo of this 800-year-old story came in 2013. When the cardinals of the Catholic Church gathered to elect a new pope, they chose a man from Argentina, a Jesuit who had spent his life working among the poor in Buenos Aires. When asked what name he would take as pope, he chose a name no pope had ever dared to take before Francis. He explained that he did so in honor of the poor man of Assisi, the man of peace, the man who loved and protected creation. In choosing that name, he was deliberately invoking the memory of the humble revolutionary who was told to rebuild the church. He was signaling a desire to steer the massive, powerful institution of the modern church back towards the core radical message that had first erupted from that small Italian town, a message of humility, of service to the poor, and of a simple, joyful love for all of God's creation. The great golden basilica in Assisi, a fortress of faith and art, still stands as a magnificent monument to what the Franciscan Order became, a powerful, wealthy, and enduring institution. But the simple world-changing idea of its founder, the idea of radical love, of finding freedom in humility, and of seeing the divine in the face of a leper, has proven to be just as indestructible. It is a spirit that could never be fully contained by stone or even by gold, and it continues to challenge and inspire the world to this day. The story of the Franciscans is the story of a paradox, a battle between a radical idea and an enduring institution. It is the story of how a revolution of absolute poverty, born from one man's dramatic rejection of wealth, became a global organization of immense power and influence. The long war for Francis's soul, fought between the idealists who clung to his every word and the pragmatists who sought to build a lasting structure, was ultimately won by the institution builders. So how did a movement founded on having nothing end up changing everything it survived? Because it was transformed. The wild, uncontrollable, charismatic energy of the early brotherhood was captured and channeled by the Church into a disciplined and effective force. Its radical passion was poured into the structures of education, creating a new class of thinkers who would help shape the modern mind. Its humility was put to work in parishes across the world. Its burning desire to travel and preach was harnessed for a global missionary enterprise that would span continents. The revolution was not crushed. It was institutionalized, and in the process, it was put to work in ways its founder could never have imagined. The legacy of that transformation is all around us. It is in the foundations of the scientific method nurtured in the halls of Oxford by friars who believed creation was worthy of study. It is in the masterpieces of Renaissance art, in the emotional humanism of Giotto, inspired by the life of a saint who saw God in the face of the poor. It is in the history of economic thought, in the work of men who tried to build a moral framework for a new world of commerce. And it echoes today in the name chosen by the current Pope, a powerful reminder of that first simple command, to rebuild the Church and to care for the marginalized. The magnificent Basilica in Assisi stands as a monument to what the Franciscan Order became, but the simple radical idea of its founder to live a life of humility, peace, and boundless love for all of creation has proven to be just as enduring. It is a spirit that could never be fully contained by stone or by gold, a timeless challenge that continues to quietly and powerfully echo throughout our world. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the entire story of the Franciscans. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most influential movements compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Secret Histories. What part of the Franciscan legacy do you find most surprising? Let us know in your comments below. We look forward to seeing you for our next investigation.